Hello and welcome to the Inside Risk and Compliance podcast. I'm your host, Adam Spencer, Director of AJ Fox Compliance, a specialist recruitment agency focusing on all things law firm risk and compliance. I have seen so many people carve amazing and fulfilling careers in this space, and it really has been a pleasure speaking to people who enjoy doing what they do every day. However, one thing that has really stood out to me is how hard it can be for people to access the bigger picture outside of their team, outside of their firm. We created this podcast to share with you some of the insights, experiences and stories of the most interesting people succeeding inside risk and compliance. Today I am joined by Jessie Williams, Head of Risk and Compliance at Excello Law. In today's episode we cover how risk and compliance is often left out of legal education, how personal sanctions can often seem unfair, and we talk about Jessie's most valued skill set, how she's never afraid to say when she doesn't know. Hope you enjoy. So we're joined today by Jessie Williams, Head of Risk and Compliance at Excello Law. Jessie, firstly, thank you so much for making such a monumental effort to come down and be here with us today. Jessie has trekked all the way down from Cardiff, 2 weeks since bringing a new family member into the world. So we can't thank you enough for sort of being here today. So thank you for coming.
No problem.
How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Busy, obviously.
Yeah, everybody seems to be busy at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, obviously we've done a bit of an intro to sort of give the listeners an idea as to who you are, but obviously we're not going to do as good a job as you can. So do you want to start by giving us an idea as to who you are, what you're up to at the moment, and then how you got into this crazy world of risk and compliance? Because your entry into this career path was not necessarily a straightforward one, right?
Yeah, no, it wasn't linear. So I currently work as Head of Risk and Compliance at Excello Law, and I've been doing that since January 22, so relatively new to that position. But I worked previously at another law firm, international law firm, as a compliance officer, and then progressed through sort of the ranks there, so compliance officer, senior officer, management there. And prior to that, I actually worked in a bank. So I worked in a high street bank. I was a branch manager of a high street bank, and I had a team of 7 staff there. So working there, obviously, I was responsible again for all of the risk and regulatory stuff in addition to the day-to-day running. So I actually fell into banking. My mum works in banking. Oh, okay. I was supposed to be doing a law degree when I was 18, finished school, straight into uni to do law. But I fell pregnant with my son, and my mum has always, sort of been quite well organised then with money. She works in the bank herself. Okay. So she was kind of like, if you go to uni now and you start renting, and you obviously have my son, but rent a house and go to university, she said, you'll never buy, because once you're caught up in that cycle of renting, you won't be able to save a deposit. So she was like, you need to drop out, like get a house, get yourself on the property ladder and then go back and do it later. So I did. I followed my mum's advice. So I dropped out, bought a house, started working in the bank with my mum. And the intention was always to go back and study law. I really knew I wanted to be a solicitor. I didn't know in what practice area, but I knew that was my sort of career interest. And banking was doing really well at the time. So it was like 2005, 2006. It was prior to the 2009 recession. There were like bonuses being thrown around like no tomorrow. I progressed really well in the bank. So I was branch manager. In my sort of early mid-20s, I was getting a bonus every quarter, which was like the equivalent of like a couple of months' salary, So it was like too good to turn down. And I kind of put law on the back burner for that reason, that I knew I was going to have to go back to being a student and not having as much money and that kind of thing. And then 2009, I was actually on maternity leave. Obviously, we had the big recession. I was worried about whether or not banking as a career generally was going to be viable. And stuck at it for a few more years, obviously, to make sure that I was in a secure position. And then just one day turned around and was like, I'm not happy. I'm not getting job satisfaction. There's no further room for progression. I loved some aspects of the role. So, like I said, the risk, the regulatory compliance. Obviously, we're FCA regulated, but you've got your anti-money laundering stuff in there. I enjoyed training the staff, and helping them with their queries and progression. I just decided to hand my notice in, quit my job, go back to undergrad, start my degree from the beginning with 2 young children. I actually was going through a divorce at the time. Didn't move back home. I bought the house next door to my parents.
Oh, wow.
So I almost moved
local.
back home, yeah. So I had a lot of support. I was really lucky. And so I did the degree. And whilst doing the degree, I knew that I needed to get a job that would give me some legal experience because I had AML and I had that background, but I didn't have any legal experience. And I thought that I'd be then going LPC training contract. So I'd need legal experience. And I started working for Admiral Law in their, so Admiral Insurance have their own sort of ABS. And I was case handling and I was dealing with personal injury claims for their drivers. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the investigative work. I enjoyed litigation. But it was very samey. It was a caseload of the same kind of clients, the same kind of case. And I enjoyed a bit more variety. So when an opening came up in their compliance team, I'd never considered compliance before. And I thought now's the time to try because obviously I'm not at the point yet where I'm qualified. I'm not specialised in a particular area. So I went into compliance there and I just loved it. I loved that there was variety. You had different types of claims come in. Obviously there were prof neg claims, complaints, but also there was policy. There was queries from lawyers about whether or not they could do some, certain things. There were conflict queries where there'd been maybe like multi-party accidents, who we could act for, who we couldn't. And I was like, oh, I like this. And also you're not client facing a lot of the time. You are sometimes with claims and complaints. Obviously there's an element of negotiating with clients when there has been a prof neg claim. But you're internal, you're the law firm's lawyer. And I really liked the exposure that gave me. But they were limited because they didn't have many practice areas. So when I finished my degree, I started the Silex route to qualification because they offered to fund it. But in that period, I was approached about another job then at an international firm, which would give me a lot. Oh, no, sorry, they weren't international actually when I first took the job. So they were a full service firm, a few offices across the UK. So I took that role because it would give me exposure to more practice areas, which meant I then was learning more, growing, because although you're not working in the practice area, the queries that you get in, so you might get a query from a residential property lawyer about whether or not they can do something if it's going to be compliant, or, an AML query. And then you'll get a private client lawyer ask you about their practice area, are they doing the right thing? So I just loved that I was constantly learning. I didn't have to go into a particular practice area and be boxed off. I kind of had this like broad exposure. So loved that. They then, so that was Gordon Dad's, they then merged with INS, so they became international almost overnight. So I went from working in this UK law firm with full exposure to all of a sudden we were doing compliance for, all of these international jurisdictions. And whilst we didn't always do all of the compliance, we did a lot of the onboarding, so a lot of the AML stuff, client due diligence. And we had to consider, obviously, that there was a different jurisdiction and the rules might be different. So, Germany's quite strict, for example. And then maybe some of the countries outside of Europe, they had different rules. So maybe didn't understand why we were holding them accountable, to our UK higher standard. So that was an interesting dynamic and I enjoyed that. And then naturally, as you progress through, the next step is to take a head of position, which I think is quite daunting anyway. During this period, obviously, I'd qualified as well as a solicitor. Sorry, I've kind of got two strands here. So the career path is one and the qualification is another. So career-wise, that was naturally the next step for me. So it was quite daunting. To take that, you're kind of like the final buck, when you take that position. When I was working as like senior manager, I always had the COLP to go to, there was an MLRO to go to, there was, a head of, there was a director of, and I was really well supported by all of those people. So if ever I made a decision, I could go to them and say, this is what I think, can you sign it off? But then when you're thinking about a position as head of, you know that you're going to be like the buck stops with you, so you need to be confident in your decision. And I took that role, obviously, and it's like you're starting again, jumping in at the deep end. I'm very well supported, so obviously the CEO of the company I work for now, Excello Law, I can go to him and bounce ideas. There's another director, Joe. I can go to Joe and say, like, what do you think? So you're never not fully supported in that role, but you do have a bigger responsibility on your shoulders. So that's kind of like career-wise where I've gone. Qualification-wise, going back to that. So I did Silex while I was at Admiral Law because that's what they offered. They didn't do training contracts, but they would fund Silex. So I thought, why not? I was happy in my job. I'll do that qualification. So I did their fast-track diploma. And then when I finished that, obviously I then moved to Gordon Dad's at the time. And I the work that I was doing, somebody queried whether compliance work would be qualifying employment, because to qualify under Silex, you have to meet certain competencies. So they'll be like negotiating, drafting, writing legal letters. There are I think there's about 50 odd competencies that you have to hit. And while I was at Admiral Law working in the compliance department, somebody who was doing the same route, who was working still in case handling, said to me, "Oh, you're going to have to go back to case handling because in compliance, you're not going to be able to do this because you're not client facing." Right. So I spoke with Silex and I said, is compliance, risk and compliance, is that a practice area? Can I use that as qualifying experience? And they said, well, yeah, because the law firm is your client. You treat the firm as your client, and when you give legal advice, potentially on a prof neg claim, you are advising the business on whether or not they should defend that claim. You are advising them on the merits of their defence. And I was like, oh yeah, you absolutely can. So I did. I obviously had moved, but I did my qualifying employment then in through Silex in risk and compliance. And you do. So when I settle a claim, I do draft a settlement agreement. So I am drafting legal documents, So you do a workplace learning portfolio. And that's where you evidence all of the work that you've done. So I did that whilst I was at Gordon Dad's /Ince as they became. And I got signed off as a chartered legal executive. And then I decided that I wanted to cross-qualify as a solicitor. So to do that, I then still needed to do the LPC and the PSC, and then apply, obviously, to the SRA to be SRA regulated. So I did that in 2020 and 2021. I did it part-time over the 2 years whilst working. And again, I was really surprised when I was doing that, how many, because there were a lot of people who when you're doing it part-time, who are working on the job. And I was surprised at how little, when you do the LPC and the PSC, how little guidance and information there is on compliance-related stuff. So that's meant to be about your practice. There's a little bit on accounts rules. There's a little bit on sort of FSMA and maybe they touched on conflicts and, there's small elements. But considering how big compliance is, I was just so surprised that they don't teach you any of that throughout throughout your undergrad, throughout your postgrad, throughout your professional skills. At no point does somebody sit down and say, when you're a lawyer, if you breach any of these regulations, there's a chance you're going to have a hefty fine from the SRA, potentially be struck off. Nobody sits you down and tells you that you have all of these rules and obligations. And I was really surprised at that, actually. I did think maybe because I'd done the Silex route, that was why I hadn't come across it, even though they have their own code of conduct. Maybe that was why. And then I did the LPC and the PSC, and I just thought, at what point do they teach you about compliance then? Because we'd be in a lecture or, in a seminar, and I'd chat with other people and I'd go, oh yeah, but you can't do that. Because if you do that, you're going to breach this rule or that rule. And they'd be like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah, I just don't understand how people don't know. So yeah, throughout my studies, I think that was something that's cropped up as well, is that people, first of all, don't know that you can qualify into risk and compliance. Yes, and I don't think many people probably do a seat in that area when they're doing their training contract, but I don't see why they couldn't. But yeah, so it hasn't been linear the way that I got into it. No,
but it's been quite really quite a rapid progression up to head of level. And you've clearly, been grafting in terms of at work, but also outside of work from an educational perspective, which is amazing. Yeah. So it all looks fantastic now. But I guess going back to when you were 26, you were getting rewarded for the role you were doing in the bank, quarterly bonuses, all the signals to say you're good at this could be your career path. 2 young children, recently divorced. How did you build the courage at that point to say, no, do you know what? This is not where my heart lies. I'm going to go back to education. That must have been a big decision, right?
Yeah, it was. And I think because I had in my head that I was always going to be a lawyer, all through when I was doing GCSEs, A-levels, all of my subjects I chose were tailored towards law. I did like finance as well. Like maths was one of the subjects that I chose. But, it was all tailored towards law. And I just didn't feel fulfilled. I knew that I could do more. And when I handed my notice in, I remember saying to somebody in the branch, I'm going to hand my notice, I'm going to go back to uni. And they were like, you don't just make a decision like that, Jess. And I was like, well, you do if you think it's something that you really want to do.
Was there a moment when that decision became really clear? Was it something you thought about for a long period of time and then it just...
I'd always said I was going to do it, and people kind of like, oh, you've left it too late now. You've had your children, you've got married, you're doing well in the bank. And I think... It was kind of like no, I know I'm capable and I want to prove to everybody else that I'm capable, but also I think I'll get satisfaction. I get satisfaction from being successful. And I think maybe I'd hit my peak a little bit too soon in the job that I was in. And I sat, and obviously I'd mentioned it to other people, and they were like, oh, you can't just make a flippant decision. But I sat down with the branch manager. She was a lady called Alison. She's brilliant. And I remember her saying to me, you're really brave. And if you put as much effort into it as you have everything else, you'll be fantastic. You know, she was really like, we don't want to lose you, but if you really like put everything into this, I think you're making the right decision almost. And that kind of like solidified it for me. So I handed my notice in the March. I didn't need to, and I was going to university in the September. So there was this really long period where I was like, oh, should I withdraw? Because everyone was like, you've got a mortgage, you've got children, like, are you making the right decision? But yeah, I wouldn't look back like now and say that I did. I'm quite glad I did it the way that I did, because I had like work experience, I had life experience. I think when you go straight from university into a degree, you don't know what you want to do. And even like, obviously I was approaching 30, graduating, and everyone would say, oh, what practice area do you want to go into? And I was like, no idea, because I've only worked in Admiral, where I've been exposed to like limited practice areas. And I think that'll probably be the same for a lot of people who are like, you know, doing an undergrad degree now. They know that they want to go into law. They maybe know that they want to be a solicitor, but they don't know what they want to do. And for me, that obviously the initial exposure to compliance when I was there, I was like, oh, this kind of pulls all of my skills into one. You know, I got AML exposure, I've got litigation exposure, I've got investigative exposure, and they were all of the strands of it that I liked. Problem solving and you know, obviously variety, because a lot of practice areas are quite monotonous.
But it sowed the seeds then, and you just knew.
But some people like that, don't they? They like to do the same thing every day. They like the reliability. They know what they're going into.
I think the majority of people we sort of speak to in this space, the variety is a large part of the attraction point.
Yeah, and the continual learning.
Yeah, and every day is, you know, different. I just wanted to take a moment out to thank our amazing sponsor, the International Compliance Association. The ICA are the leading professional body for the global regulatory and financial crime community, offering professional qualifications, world-class events and training. Go check them out online, and if any of the certificates or courses take your fancy, then you can get 10% discount using our code AJFOX10 at checkout. One of the things you mentioned when you were talking about the education piece was, you know, perhaps a lack of education through the normal legal education route around what risk and compliance is. And I know we talked previously about, you know, what is the general fee earner population's sort of view of who risk and compliance are, what they do they like them, do they not like them? You know, what has your experience of that been, you know, throughout your career, and are there sort of challenges in getting everybody on the same page?
Yes, so you're always received differently, you know, by certain people. So I find that some people are really receptive to a compliance department. They're so grateful for the support. They understand how important it is to get things right, you know, the sanctions for non-compliance, and they want to get it right. And you're so well received. And I would say that is the majority of lawyers within a firm, you know. But there are, I find, times where you'll come across individuals who don't see the importance, don't understand the importance, potentially are used to doing things their way. There wasn't such an emphasis on risk and compliance in the past, so they maybe don't understand how rapidly things have progressed in that field, and that they are obliged. It's not a choice anymore. You know, the SRA don't just look and go, oh, you qualified 40 years ago, you didn't have to do CDD then, we'll let you off. You know, that doesn't happen. So I think sometimes it can be hard to change the mentality around why. And some people will see compliance officers, you know, head of risk and compliance, you know, whatever you are, as like a block. So you're making their daily life harder. You know, they just want to pick up a client, crack on with the work, you know, get maybe a sale from start to finish quickly for their client, because that's what they want and that's what they're used to. So when you come in and go, oh, hang on, you can't do that. You know, I know you've acted for them for 5 years, but we do still need to make sure that maybe like the ownership of the company hasn't changed. So it can be difficult to change the mentality around why. Some people think it's the firm, it's a firm policy. Like say you're just putting the blockers on, you're being an overkill, a job's worth. And it can be difficult. But I do try to speak directly to people myself as much as I can. I won't rely on, but the company says you have to do that. I try to be flexible. I try to explain the significance of what we're doing, why we're doing it. We're there to protect them. We're the first line of defence. If we can pick up that you're doing it wrong, then the SRA can pick it up as well if they come in and audit you. And for me to tell you that you're doing it wrong and ask you to do it right is obviously the best option for you rather than the SRA and come in and say you're doing it wrong. The company policy is this. You've been told that you need to do it this way. You're not following. So you're personally going to be sanctioned for that rather than the firm even.
And you've got to try and change those views alongside doing your day job, right? And managing other people and looking after lots of other issues. So it must be difficult on time. But if you had unlimited time, if you had financial resources, human resources, are there things you think you would be able to do to change the view of risk and compliance within a firm, any firm?
Yeah, so the firms that I've worked at, a lot of the time the compliance team will be remote because you don't have a compliance team in every office, and I think that'll be the same across most firms. So what we did at my last firm, and what I do go to the London office in this firm, and I've been to our Birmingham office, but I've said this is something that I want to do going forward, is I've said I need to try and get out to the offices. When you're a person, rather than somebody on the end of the phone or somebody on the end of an email, I think you're a lot more approachable. And I think also people are worried to come and ask a question, compliance related, or to put it in an email because there's an audit trail and they're worried that somebody's going to say, you're doing it wrong. But what they don't realise is that we want you to come to us. If you think you're not doing something the right way, come to us because we want to resolve it. We want to fix it. We want you to understand what you should be doing. So I've said that I think what I'd like to do, if I have more time and resource, is to get out to the office and say, every month I'm in this office, or every fortnight I'm in this office. Come and see me. We don't bite. And I think that is the perception sometimes of a compliance team is like, don't go to them. They're going to kind of slap you on the wrist. And and it's not the case. Like, we're not there to police you. We're there to support you. So I think, resource wise, time wise, that's what I've put forward, obviously, and again, I'm very well supported where I am. So that is what I want to do. Get out, do like compliance clinics almost. And I would encourage, others to do that as well, because I think when people know you as an individual rather than your job title or what you do, they're much more likely to come to you. Obviously, I've got a really good working relationship with a lot of our lawyers now because I've been at the firm a while, and a lot of them would just pick up the phone almost daily and say, just while I've got you, can I ask you this question? And they realise that I'm going to just, like I say, assist them, support them. If I don't know the answer, I'll go and find the answer for them and take that pressure off them so they can get on with the day-to-day stuff. So that would be...
That's a challenge. A lot of time involved in getting out there and speaking
because
to all
then
these
it's
people.
hard to get to the project work, isn't it? So rules will change, and you need to change policy. Our terms of business need to be updated. We might need to, produce a new policy and then obviously train the staff on what they need to do. So it is difficult, I think, to juggle all of the plates. But obviously, I can do my day job from an office and still be there if somebody wants to come over. But I think it's about being visible, being accessible, and being a person. To try and break those
them, right? And you mentioned before, and we've spoken about this before, around sanctions for non-compliance. And I know you'd said you'd done your dissertation on this as well. It's not an area I know a huge amount about, but I've seen picked up themes, I guess, around there's been concerns about lots of junior unsupported solicitors being held accountable a lot as well, and maybe not so much at the higher levels. What was your what were you doing on your dissertation around personal sanctions?
So it's just about so whether or not they're sort of fair. There's actually been a recent individual, I think they were non-qualified individual who had a fine for not following AML procedures. And I think a lot of the staff in our firm, for example, I shared it and I said, you might not think that you are, just because you're not a solicitor, because you're a paralegal, you might think, the SRA won't come to me and they won't sanction me because I'm not a lawyer. But when you work in an SRA regulated firm, you can be sanctioned, particularly if you're not following the procedure. So I think that sometimes that can be maybe a little bit harsh. And that was the tone, I think, of the dissertation that I wrote was, is it fair? There is no training given to, as we've said, to lawyers when they do the LPC, the PSC. They start in their practice area and they've got to get up to speed with everything that applies to their area of law. But at no point does somebody come in and sit them down and say, well, we give a compliance induction, but it depends on the firm that you work for. Yeah. But at no point during their educational side of things does somebody come in and sit them down and say, right, let's go through do you want to work in a regulated area? Let's go through all of the AML rules, why we do it, it's terrorist funding. And, nobody ever sits them down and goes through that legislation with them and what their obligations are under that. So is it fair then to say, oh, you've breached regs, here's a 10 grand fine, or you're going to be suspended or struck off? Or, they are usually extreme cases, where people are in a position where they should know better, particularly in the case of experienced solicitors. Yeah. But I just think, is it fair when there's no mandatory training? Yeah. The SRA dictate what goes into, what needs to be covered in the LPC, and there are certain topics that have to be done, and the PSC, there are certain topics that you have to pass those modules to qualify. So why is there not one on AML if you give such hefty sanctions and personal sanctions for non-compliance?
It's interesting. Is there, and there's no sort of regulations around there being somebody in a position who should be providing that training?
Yeah, as a firm, you have to provide training. The regulations do stipulate that you have to give training. So we, roll out annual training, for example. But until you're in a firm where you're having maybe effective training, and I just think...
Is that assessed when you have audits, when the SRA come in? Do
they do
level
check.
Of training,
yeah,
right?
they do check that obviously you are giving annual training to your staff.
Do they dig into it?
I don't know if it's annual or if it's just regular training. I don't know the wording off the top of my head. But they will check, because if somebody's been non-compliant, they'll want to know, firstly, were they told what they should do to be compliant? Yeah. So all of the new joiners with us will go through a compliance induction. We'll tell them what their obligations are, what the firm policy is. So I'm trying to break down that this is what the policy is, and the reason that you have to do it is because there's these AML regulations which dictate you have to do it, is to try and break down that barrier that it's not just us being a job's worth. There is a reason why. But I just think that sometimes people might still not understand, and not everybody's okay to put their hand up and go, I still don't understand why I need to do that. Or they might say, yeah, great, I understand why I need to do it, but you can't monitor every individual in the firm 24/7. You don't know that they understand how to check source of funds. You've told them, you've trained them, you've gone through it with them, and they've said that they understand, but everybody learns in different ways. So you don't know. And we audit files. We randomly select files and audit them, but there could be somebody that slips through that net. And I think sometimes, like, there's been cases where people have been sanctioned. One of the examples I used in my dissertation, they didn't really get any financial benefit from it. They just clearly didn't understand. And then obviously on the flip side, you think, well, if you're in a position of, you're a solicitor, you're well educated, why don't you understand? You should be intelligent enough to understand. But
we talked about knowing the unknowns, right? Or knowing that you don't know things. And you mentioned that when we were speaking previously, we're asking sort of what was your, where do you feel your strengths are in this space? And actually you mentioned that part of the challenge is a lot of the time there's so much that you don't know. And I guess as a regulatory, as an environment, is changing all the time as well.
All of the time.
Maybe there's the message out there to these fee earners that they need to be aware they don't know, around this all the time. You're there to support them when issues come up, right?
Yeah, so obviously, you asked me, so what is your sort of super skill? Where do you think that you have it? And I just thought, I don't, because I'll never know everything about any topic, and nobody will. Obviously, you can be an expert in the field, but the field changes so regularly that it's impossible. Fraudsters will always find new ways to launder money. If somebody wants something bad enough, they'll do whatever they can to get it. And I think there's so many risks to firms. Not only of money laundering, but like cyber attacks we're seeing all the time now, and data breaches, and there's just, it can come from all angles when you work in risk and compliance, and you're constantly horizon scanning, and the SRA are changing the rules, and the regs might be updated, and then we've got Brexit, so there could be new rules, and then you've got like the ICO and the data protection stuff changed, because we had
there's
to
no
GDPR,
normal day,
and
right? Every day
so there's just so many things going on, and I think like I was saying earlier, as a lawyer in your practice area, there'll be changes to the way that things are done as well. So nobody will ever know everything. So I just think that the whole sort of like barrier between lawyer and compliance team. And I think as well, sometimes people are like, oh, shall I phone the SRA and ask them? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Utilize everything. That's why they have an ethics helpline. Like, everybody needs to talk and learn and continually, just accept that you're not going to always get it right or know the answer.
Yeah.
But what's important is that you know where to go, where to find the answer, where to ask the questions, that you are supported. I'll sometimes say to lawyers when they come to me, I don't know, but I'm going to go and find the answer for you. And I think that's probably what I'm really good at.
Yeah.
That is my expert skill, is that I'm not afraid to say, I don't know, but let me go and find out. Because I want to make sure that
you always knew the answer, right? And you were just sat there,
I think dangerous as well. If you're happy to go, yeah, great, that's the answer. Off you go. Don't challenge yourself, because just because that was the answer 6 months ago in risk and compliance, things can change so quickly. Is that still the answer? I will always go and check and just go, okay, so last time somebody asked me this kind of question, the rule was this, but let me just check that rule hasn't changed. And obviously I'm on maternity leave at the moment, so I need to try and make sure that I keep up to date with any changes. I did email, obviously I've got a team of two, so I emailed Emma and Helen the other day, and I was like, just to let you know, I think this is updated, so we're going to need to update our firm-wide risk assessment, and I need to make sure that when I go back from maternity, I haven't got like 9 months or whatever of work to catch up on. But
I think that is what so many people that we speak to love about this space, how varied it is. But look, you've had an amazing career path, accelerated so quickly, and it's been really helpful to get a picture of that journey. If we've got a listener out there or listeners out there who are maybe considering risk and compliance in a law firm, not done it before, or maybe they've just landed in their first risk and compliance role, or perhaps they're just looking at a career change generally, is there any advice you would give to them?
Yeah, go for it. Just jump in like I did, like 2 feet first, just throw yourself into it. I think that it's such an evolving area of law as well, and it's not going anywhere. If anything, there's only going to be more emphasis and more focus on it, and we need more people in that space. I've recently recruited into my team, and it's really hard to find somebody who's got like full service risk and compliance experience. We need more people to get into the compliance field, I think, and to really immerse themselves into risk and compliance as a career. Just go for it. Don't be afraid, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Like Fantastic. I said, nobody ever knows everything. Well,
that's great advice. I mean, I've obviously had a career change in my career as well, and I would echo that absolutely. As soon as you take the plunge, you don't look back. You realise it's the right decision. So that's fantastic. So thank you so much, Jessie. That's been absolutely amazing talking to you. I'm sure there's absolutely loads of value in there for all our listeners. So Jessie, thank you so much. That's been absolutely fantastic having you here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We really hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast as much as we enjoyed recording it. If you did, please do us a huge, huge favour and share it with a friend or a colleague. The more people we can get listening, the more time and energy we can get into recording more episodes and getting the best guests and the most interesting stories and insights. I want to say a huge thank you to the ICA for their support, to Ty and Karem here in the studio, and a massive thanks to Kat for making sure everything runs so smoothly behind the scenes. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, follow us on LinkedIn to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.